We've all asked it. After every headline, every trial, every documentary that crosses our screens. How? How does someone do that to another human being? How does a person look at another person, a child, a stranger, someone who trusts them, and see not a human being, but an opportunity? It's the question that has haunted philosophers, psychologists, and everyday people since the beginning of civilization. We've been conditioned to think of evil as something foreign, something that wears a mask, something that lives in shadows and announces itself with violence. We imagine predators as lurking figures in alleyways, strangers in trench coats, monsters who are easy to spot and easy to avoid. But the psychological reality is far more disturbing. Evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it funds scholarships. Sometimes it calls you sweetheart and tells you you're special. Sometimes it sits across from you at a dinner party, laughs at your jokes, and makes you feel like you've finally met someone who understands you. And all the while, underneath that charming exterior, something else is operating entirely. Empathy is our superpower. It's what allows us to connect, to trust, to love. It's the foundation of every healthy relationship we'll ever have. From the moment we're born, we're wired to seek connection, to read faces, to respond to the emotions of others. This capacity for empathy is what makes us human. It's what allows us to build families, communities, civilizations. But what happens when that instinct is weaponized? What happens when one person's capacity for empathy meets another's complete and utter void of it? What happens when the very thing that makes us human becomes the thing that makes us vulnerable? Today, we're exploring the gap between empathy and evil through one of the most extensively documented cases in modern history, the case of Jeffrey Epstein. We'll examine the perpetrator's void, the chilling absence where conscience should be. We'll explore the victim's mirror, the innate human capacity for trust that gets brutally exploited. And we'll dissect the accomplice's trap, where empathy becomes enmeshment, where loyalty becomes complicity. This isn't just another true crime story. This is a psychological deep dive into how ordinary human qualities, trust, hope, ambition, the desire to belong, can be turned against us by predators who have spent their lives perfecting the art of manipulation. Over the next hour, we'll look at court documents, psychological assessments, and survivor testimony to understand not just what happened, but how it happened. Because understanding the mechanics of exploitation is the only way we can hope to prevent it. To understand the predator, we have to first understand the psychological architecture that makes predation possible. We're not just talking about a lack of feeling. We're talking about an active, strategic void, a mind built not to connect with others, but to consume them. Forensic experts call this the Dark Triad, 3 personality traits that, when they converge, create something profoundly dangerous. These traits have been studied for decades by psychologists trying to understand what makes certain individuals capable of harming others without remorse. First, psychopathy. When most people hear this word, they think of violent criminals. But psychopathy is more nuanced than that. It's characterized by a profound lack of empathy, shallow emotions, and an inability to form genuine emotional bonds. The psychopath doesn't feel guilt or remorse the way you and I do. They can mimic emotions. They can smile. They can cry. They can say, "I love you," with perfect conviction. But underneath, there's nothing. It's a performance. Brain scans of psychopaths show consistent abnormalities. Reduced activity in the amygdala, the region that generates fear and emotional response, and a disconnect between the amygdala and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the region that integrates emotion into decision-making. In simple terms, the part of the brain that generates feeling and the part that processes social cues aren't talking to each other. They're cold because they're literally incapable of feeling warmth. Second, narcissism. This isn't just taking a lot of selfies or being confident. Narcissistic personality disorder involves grandiosity, a sense of entitlement, and a desperate need for admiration. The narcissist believes they're special, that ordinary rules don't apply to them. They exploit others without guilt because, in their mind, they deserve special treatment. Other people exist to serve them, to admire them, to reflect back their own magnificence. Third, Machiavellianism. Named after the Renaissance political philosopher who wrote The Prince. This trait involves manipulation, cunning, and a strategic view of human relationships. The Machiavellian individual sees every interaction as a game to be won. They're calculating, pragmatic, and completely unencumbered by morality when pursuing their goals. Now, here's what makes this clinically significant. These three traits don't just coexist. They interact. They amplify each other. Forensic psychologists call this the amplifier effect. The psychopathic callousness enables exploitation without remorse. The narcissistic entitlement motivates and justifies the exploitation. I deserve this, I'm special, these people are lucky to be in my orbit. And the Machiavellian intelligence provides the strategic cunning to orchestrate it all without getting caught. When you have all three, and when you add superior cognitive functioning and extraordinary resources, you get something terrifying, a predator who can operate within systems, who can manipulate institutions, who can surround themselves with powerful people who become unwitting shields. A predator who can operate for decades without facing consequences. This is what forensic psychologists found when they analyzed Jeffrey Epstein. He wasn't just a wealthy man with bad behavior. He was a textbook case of the Dark Triad in action. In 2026, two board-certified forensic psychologists independently evaluated Jeffrey Epstein using the same clinical tools they'd use on a living subject. This was a posthumous assessment conducted after his death, based on over 8,500 pages of court documents and more than 2,300 pages of victim testimony. They undertook this massive project because Epstein's psychology is so instructive, so textbook in its presentation, that it needed to be documented for future investigators and clinicians. What they found was striking, even for professionals who had spent their careers studying the darkest corners of human psychology. On the Psychopathy checklist revised, the gold standard for measuring psychopathic traits, developed by Dr. Robert Hare, Epstein scored a 29 out of 40. That approaches the clinical threshold for psychopathy, which is typically set at 30 in North America. But here's what's even more telling. On Factor 1 of that test, which measures interpersonal and emotional deficits, he scored a perfect 16 out of 16. Factor 1 includes traits like grandiosity, deceitfulness, lack of remorse, shallow affect, and callousness. A perfect score means that on every measurable indicator of emotional disconnection, Epstein rated at the maximum. 100% of the traits that reflect a profound inability to connect with others emotionally. This wasn't just someone who occasionally lacked empathy. This wasn't someone who made poor choices or had a troubled childhood. This was someone whose psychological makeup was fundamentally incapable of forming genuine emotional bonds. The hardware simply wasn't there. But psychopathy was only one piece of the puzzle. The assessment also revealed severe narcissistic personality disorder, meeting 8 of the 9 diagnostic criteria. That's the entitlement, the grandiosity, the belief that normal rules don't apply. Court documents show Epstein repeatedly expressing that belief. He told associates he was above the law. He told victims they should feel lucky to be in his presence. He built an entire world that reinforced his grandiosity. Private islands, powerful friends, a constant stream of young women brought to his door. And then there's Machiavellianism. Epstein scored very high on every behavioral indicator. The strategic cultivation of relationships over decades. The careful grooming of victims over months and years. The building of a criminal enterprise that operated across multiple continents, involving recruitment, transportation, and exploitation on a massive scale. This wasn't impulsive behavior. This was calculated, methodical, and brilliantly concealed. Dr. John Dunn, one of the forensic psychologists who conducted the assessment, told me, Epstein represents a case study in how the Dark Triad operates in the real world. He didn't just have these traits. He had the intelligence and resources to operationalize them on a massive scale. That's what made him so dangerous. He could have used those abilities for anything, building businesses, advancing science, helping people. Instead, he used them to build a machine for exploitation. But here's the question that kept investigators up at night. How did he get access? How did a man with this psychological profile manage to insert himself into the lives of so many young women? How did he convince parents to trust him? How did he build a network that spanned the globe? To answer that, we have to look at the other side of the equation. We have to look at the victims. And that story begins on a park bench in Michigan in the summer of 1994. Interlochen Center for the Arts sits on a peninsula between two lakes in northern Michigan. Since 1928, it has been a sanctuary for young artists, musicians, writers, actors, dancers who come from across the country to hone their craft surrounded by natural beauty. It's the kind of place parents feel safe sending their children. The kind of place where nothing bad is supposed to happen. The kind of place where young people go to dream about their futures. In the summer of 1994, a 14-year-old girl sat on a park bench between classes. She was in the singing program at Interlochen, one of the most prestigious arts camps in the nation. She was talented. She was ambitious. She was like so many teenagers, searching for something, recognition, opportunity, a way out of the ordinary life that seemed to stretch before her. Her name in court documents is Jane Doe. A man and woman approach her on that bench. The man was Jeffrey Epstein, then 41 years old. The woman was Ghislaine Maxwell, then in her early 30s. They struck up a conversation. Epstein bragged about being a patron of the arts, about the scholarships he funded. He mentioned a camp lodge that bore his name. Think about that for a moment. Two adults approaching an unaccompanied minor at a summer camp. In any other context, alarms would go off. But Epstein and Maxwell didn't set off alarms. They set off something else entirely. They made her feel special. They made her feel seen. They made her feel like she mattered. Here's what the court documents reveal. Epstein and Maxwell probed her at length about her background, her family situation, where she lived. They learned that her father had died a year earlier, that her family in Palm Beach was struggling financially, that she was carrying the weight of loss and the burden of economic uncertainty at an age when she should have been focused on music and friendship. This is the first stage of predatory grooming, identification of vulnerability. They didn't approach randomly. They didn't pick the most confident girl, the one with two parents and a stable home. They approached strategically, looking for someone who might be receptive, someone with a void they could fill, a wound they could exploit, a need they could meet. Before she left, Epstein asked for her mother's phone number. A few months later, he invited them both to his Palm Beach mansion for tea. Not a business meeting, not a formal interview. Tea, the most innocent, civilized, non-threatening invitation imaginable. Now watch how this unfolds. To Jane's mother, Epstein presented himself as a mentor. He told her he likes to mentor people. He talked about supporting young talent, about giving back, about helping promising young artists achieve their dreams. The mother was happy for her daughter. She began referring to Epstein as Jane's godfather. What mother wouldn't be happy? A wealthy philanthropist takes an interest in her artistic daughter, invites them to his beautiful home, offers opportunities, pays for voice lessons. This is the dream, isn't it? This is what every parent wants for their child. This is the kind of break that can change a young person's life. The mother didn't know she was watching a predator at work. She didn't know that the godfather was actually a hunter and her daughter was prey. She didn't know that the tea party was the beginning of a nightmare that would last for years. Jane became a regular at the waterfront property. They'd hang out by the pool. He'd take her to movies, take her shopping, building a relationship, giving her things, taking her places, making her feel important, making her feel chosen. Epstein paid for her voice lessons. Sometimes he'd give her cash and tell her to give it to her mother because he knew they needed it. He positioned himself as a benefactor, a supporter, someone who cared about her family's well-being. He wasn't just helping Jane, he was helping her whole family. That made him indispensable. that made him impossible to question. This wasn't random kindness. This was a calculated process psychologists call grooming. Grooming is gradual desensitization. It's the creation of dependency. It's the offer of financial or educational opportunities that make escape feel impossible. It's the slow, careful erosion of boundaries that happens so gradually that the victim doesn't even notice until it's too late. When Jane arrived at the mansion, she sometimes found Maxwell in revealing clothing by the pool. The teen thought it was strange, but Maxwell normalized it. She was like a cool older sister, making comments that framed this as normal adult behavior. "This is what grown-ups do," she'd say. "You'll understand when you're older." This single approach is a masterclass in manipulation. It serves multiple functions simultaneously. It normalizes behavior that should be alarming. It positions Maxwell as an authority on adulthood, someone who knows the secrets that Jane hasn't yet learned. It makes the victim feel immature, naive, for even questioning it. And it creates a shared secret. We know what grown-ups do, even if others don't understand. Several months into the relationship, Jane was alone with Epstein in the pool house. He asked what she wanted to do with her life. She wanted to be an actress and model. He told her he was best friends with the owner of Victoria's Secret. Told her she'd have to have photographs taken, be comfortable in her underwear, not be a prude. And then the relationship turned sexual. The abuse would continue for nearly 3 years. Think about the psychology of this moment. Jane was 14 years old. She was alone with a powerful older man who had been kind to her family, who had paid for her lessons, who had made her feel special. And now he was framing sexual activity as the price of admission to the life she dreamed of. Not as abuse, not as exploitation, as opportunity, as what it takes to make it in the world. One survivor later described this psychological trap. "I felt like they loved me, like they supported me. I felt like I needed to be grateful to them. And I recognized that it affected my life profoundly. Struggling in relationships, struggling to open up and trust people." That's the trauma bond. That's what happens when empathy is exploited at its most fundamental level. The victim doesn't just lose her innocence. She loses her ability to trust, to connect, to believe that anyone who shows her kindness might actually mean it. The predator steals not just her body, but her faith in human goodness. Jane was just one victim, and Epstein's operation was designed for scale. This wasn't a predator working alone in the shadows. This was a criminal enterprise with systems, processes, and multiple people involved in its operation. In Florida, he targeted girls from disadvantaged neighborhoods. In New York, he targeted aspiring young women with scholarships and elite connections. In Eastern Europe, he used modeling contacts to find victims abroad. He built a pipeline that spanned the globe, bringing young women to his properties in Palm Beach, New York, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and beyond. Court documents describe a systematic approach. Victims were recruited through various channels: schools, malls, modeling agencies, word of mouth. They were brought to Epstein's properties, often with promises of money or career opportunities. They were introduced to a lifestyle of wealth and privilege that most had never experienced. And here's where it gets truly insidious. Victims became recruiters. A 16-year-old girl testified to a grand jury that a high school classmate approached her about making money working for this guy Epstein. She was told she'd be giving massages, that there would be certain expectations, that the money was good. She went to the house. After the massage, Epstein gave her a proposition: bring other girls to the house, and for every girl she brought, she'd make $200. She recruited acquaintances from her high school, most between 16 and 18, the youngest just 14. A 23-year-old was considered too old. Epstein told her, "The younger the better." This is the machine. Victims become recruiters because they've been normalized to the exploitation, because they need the money, because they've been told this is how the world works, that this is the price of opportunity, that everyone is doing it. The predator doesn't have to find every victim himself. His victims find new victims for him. The psychological term for this is trauma bonding combined with identification with the aggressor. Victims, in order to survive psychologically, begin to see the world from the predator's perspective. They minimize the abuse. They rationalize it. They even participate in extending it to others. It's a survival mechanism. If you can convince yourself that what's happening isn't really that bad, and if you can become part of the system rather than just its target, you can maintain some sense of control in a situation where you actually have none. It will be almost 2 decades before Jane Doe told anyone what happened to her. Understanding what happened was difficult. Epstein and Maxwell had been like her family. She felt like they loved her, like they supported her. She felt she needed to be grateful to them, and she recognized that it affected her life profoundly, struggling in relationships, struggling to open up and trust people. This is the trauma bond. This is what happens when empathy is exploited at its most fundamental level. The victim spends years, sometimes decades, trying to untangle the knot of gratitude and violation, love and abuse, trust and betrayal. So what makes someone vulnerable to this kind of exploitation? The answer is uncomfortable. Almost anyone under the right circumstances. It's a question that victims often ask themselves. Why me? What is wrong with me? Why did I fall for it? And the answer is almost never what they fear. Research on grooming and exploitation reveals several key factors that predators look for. But here's what's crucial to understand. These aren't exotic pathologies or rare psychological conditions. They're ordinary human needs. They're what make us human. First, a need for connection. Teenagers are biologically programmed to seek validation outside their families. It's a normal developmental stage, part of becoming an independent adult. But it's also a vulnerability, the desire to be seen as special, as mature, as worthy of adult attention. Predators recognize this need and position themselves to fill it. Second, economic vulnerability. Epstein specifically targeted girls from families with financial struggles. The voice lessons, the cash for mothers, the promises of modeling careers, these weren't just kindnesses. They were chains. When someone is providing for your family, when they're making your mother's life easier, when they're paying for your dreams, how do you say no? How do you risk losing all of that? Third, the absence of protective factors. Jane's father had died. Other victims were runaways, estranged from their families, or simply neglected by parents who were too busy, too distracted, too burdened by their own struggles to notice what was happening. The predator looks for the gap in someone's life and fills it with himself. Fourth, ambition. The desire for a better life, for success, for the kind of opportunities that seem out of reach. Epstein didn't just offer exploitation. He offered access, connections, the chance to be someone, to matter, to escape the ordinary. For a 14-year-old dreaming of stardom, that's an almost irresistible lure. None of these are weaknesses. They're human. They're what make us who we are. And that's precisely what makes this kind of exploitation so devastating. It uses our best qualities against us. Our empathy, our trust, our hope, our ambition, our desire to belong, to matter, to be seen. These aren't flaws. They're gifts. They're what allow us to form families, build communities, create art, fall in love. But in the hands of a predator, they become weapons. As one survivor wrote in her journal, "The worst part isn't what he did to my body. The worst part is what he did to my trust. I don't know how to get it back. I don't know if I'll ever be able to look at someone who's kind to me and not wonder what they really want." Perhaps the most chilling dynamic in the Epstein case is the role of Ghislaine Maxwell. She wasn't just an accomplice. She wasn't just someone who knew and looked the other way. She was active. She was essential. She was the bridge between the predator's world and the victim's world. To understand Maxwell, you have to understand where she came from. She was born in 1961, the ninth child of Robert Maxwell, a media tycoon so powerful and corrupt that his life reads like a thriller novel. He built a publishing empire that included newspapers, books, and other media properties. He was a billionaire, a friend of presidents and prime ministers, a man who seemed to have everything. But Robert Maxwell was also a fraud. He stole millions from his own employees' pension funds, looting the retirement savings of hard-working people to prop up his failing businesses. In 1991, he died under mysterious circumstances, falling from his yacht off the Canary Islands. Conspiracy theories about his death continue to this day. Was it suicide? Accident? Murder? We may never know. Growing up in the Maxwell household meant growing up in a world of immense wealth, immense ambition, and immense dysfunction. Robert Maxwell was described by those who knew him as bullying, grandiose, and utterly without scruples. He dominated his family, his employees, everyone around him. Sound familiar? Ghislaine was her father's favorite. She accompanied him everywhere, learned his ways, absorbed his worldview. She saw how power worked, how charisma could be used, how people could be manipulated. When he died, and when his frauds were exposed, she lost everything. The fortune vanished. The reputation collapsed. The powerful friends disappeared. She went from being a princess of the media world to being the daughter of a disgraced thief. And then she met Jeffrey Epstein. What did she see in him? Perhaps a replacement for her father. Another powerful, wealthy, grandiose man who could give her back the world she'd lost. Perhaps she saw an opportunity to rebuild her life. Perhaps she saw a kindred spirit, someone else who understood that the rules were for other people. Whatever she saw, she attached herself to him completely. Survivors describe Maxwell's role in complex, contradictory terms. One survivor, in a 2020 email begging a judge to deny Maxwell bail, wrote, "I believe she is a psychopath." Maxwell, she said, had not only abused her, but played a central role in procuring girls for Epstein to abuse. And yet she also described Maxwell as both charming and manipulative with me during the grooming process. This is the accomplice's dual nature, perpetrator and victim, abuser and abused, charming and manipulative all at once. She was never just one thing. She was both the hand that reached out to help and the hand that pushed you into the fire. She was the one who made you feel safe and the one who made sure you weren't. This complexity is what makes accomplices so difficult to understand and so difficult to prosecute. They're not pure evil. They're not simple monsters. They're human beings who made choices, who got trapped, who became complicit. And understanding how that happens is essential to understanding how these systems of exploitation persist. Maxwell's specific role in the operation was crucial. Epstein, for all his wealth and power, was still a middle-aged man. Approaching teenage girls directly carried risk. It could trigger alarms. It could create suspicion. But Maxwell, she could approach anyone. She positioned herself as the friendly, non-threatening bridge between the girl's world and Epstein's. She normalized what should have been abnormal. She made the strange feel familiar. She was the gateway through which victims passed on their way to Epstein. When victims arrived at the mansion, Maxwell was often the one who greeted them. She'd chat with them, make them comfortable, ask about their lives. She'd model the behavior Epstein wanted, lounging by the pool, making casual references to adult situations, treating the whole thing as perfectly ordinary, perfectly normal. And if a victim was hesitant, Maxwell was there to reassure them. If a victim was confused, Maxwell was there to explain. If a victim tried to pull away, Maxwell was there to pull them back. She was the one who made it all make sense. After the first inappropriate encounter with 14-year-old Jane Doe, Maxwell called her and said, "Well, aren't you a clever girl?" Jeffrey was very impressed. This chilling praise served multiple purposes. It rewarded the victim for compliance. It framed the abuse as something the victim had achieved, something to be proud of, something that made her special. It told her that she had done well, that she had pleased them, that she was now part of their inner circle. And it reinforced Maxwell's role as the bridge between the victim's world and Epstein's. The one who interprets, who explains, who makes meaning out of meaninglessness. Years later, after Jane turned 18, Maxwell laid out a schoolgirl outfit on a bed and suggested she serve Epstein tea while wearing it. The victim complied. Epstein assaulted her again. Law enforcement later recovered a schoolgirl outfit from Epstein's New York mansion in 2019. Think about the layers of manipulation here. Jane was now an adult. She could have walked away. She could have said no. But the conditioning was too deep. The trauma bond was too strong. Maxwell knew exactly which buttons to push, exactly how to frame the request, exactly how to make compliance feel like choice. This is the accomplice's trap in full operation. Maxwell wasn't just facilitating abuse. She was choreographing it. She was directing it. She was making it happen. And she did it not with threats or violence, but with the tools of connection and manipulation that she had mastered over years of practice. So how does someone become this? How does a woman from a privileged background become a facilitator of exploitation for a predator? How does someone cross the line from bystander to participant, from observer to accomplice? The psychology of the accomplice is complex, but several factors consistently appear in the research and in case studies like Maxwell's. First, the trauma bond. Maxwell had lost everything: her father, her fortune, her social position, her identity. Epstein offered her a new life, a new identity, a new purpose. She became dependent on him emotionally, financially, and socially. That dependency made it nearly impossible to see him clearly. When someone is your lifeline, you don't question where they're taking you. Second, normalization. When you're surrounded by something every day, it stops seeming abnormal. Maxwell was present for years of exploitation. She participated in it. She facilitated it. She saw victims come and go. She heard the justifications, the rationalizations, the explanations. At some point, the cognitive dissonance becomes too great to maintain, and the mind resolves it by deciding that this is just how things are. The abnormal becomes normal. The unthinkable becomes routine. Third, compartmentalization. Maxwell could be the sophisticated socialite at a dinner party, laughing with guests and discussing art, and the facilitator at Epstein's mansion, procuring young women for abuse, because those two selves never had to meet. She could separate her identity into pieces, each one unaware of the others. This is a psychological survival mechanism that allows people to function in situations that would otherwise be unbearable. Fourth, identification with the aggressor. This is a psychological defense mechanism first described by psychoanalyst Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter. When someone is in a position of powerlessness relative to an aggressor, they may adopt the aggressor's perspective and behaviors as a way of coping. If you can't beat them, join them. And if you join them enthusiastically enough, maybe you won't be their next victim. Was Maxwell afraid of Epstein? Did she participate in part because she knew what happened to people who disappointed him? We may never know for certain. But the psychological literature suggests that many accomplices are driven by a complex mixture of fear, dependency, and genuine alignment with the perpetrator's worldview. They're not simple victims. They're not simple perpetrators. There's something in between, and that ambiguity is exactly what makes their psychology so difficult to untangle. But the accomplice's trap extends far beyond Maxwell. Consider the broader network of people connected to Epstein. The court documents include a message slip from Epstein's Palm Beach home showing a missed call from Donald Trump recorded at 5:18 p.m. No date, just the time. Another accuser said she was warned that Epstein's ties to Bill Clinton could end her career if she spoke out. Prince Andrew's name appears repeatedly in witness testimony and flight logs. Les Wexner, the billionaire founder of Victoria's Secret, gave Epstein sweeping financial power over his affairs. The list goes on. Numerous politicians, businessmen, celebrities, and academics whose names appear in flight logs, phone records, and witness testimony. This isn't about partisan politics. This is about how power creates a bubble of plausible deniability. When you're surrounded by influential people, when your phone logs contain names of presidents and princes, when billionaires treat you as an equal and celebrities attend your dinner parties, it becomes easier to believe that what you're doing must be acceptable. The cognitive dissonance gets smoothed over by the company you keep. If all these powerful people respect him, He must be legitimate. If all these successful people trust him, my discomfort must be wrong. If no one else is raising alarms, I must be overreacting. The people who flew on Epstein's plane, who attended his dinner parties, who accepted his donations, who posed for photos with him, most of them probably never knew the full scope of his crimes. But their presence, their acceptance, their willingness to be associated with him, all of it served as a shield. All of it made him seem legitimate. All of it made victims feel that they must be wrong, that if so many powerful people respected him, surely he couldn't be what their instincts were telling them he was. This is systemic enmeshment, not just one accomplice, but an entire network of people who, through their association, enabled the exploitation to continue for decades. They provided social proof. They provided cover. They provided the appearance of normalcy that allowed Epstein to operate in plain sight. Some of them may have known more than they've admitted. Some may have suspected, but chosen not to ask. Some may have been genuinely ignorant. But all of them, through their presence in his orbit, contributed to the machinery that kept him safe. And that's the uncomfortable truth about systems of exploitation. They don't run on evil alone. They run on ordinary human tendencies, trust, ambition, social conformity, the desire to be part of something bigger than ourselves. The same qualities that build communities can also, in the wrong context, enable predators. Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted in 2021 of sex trafficking and other crimes. She's currently serving a 20-year sentence in federal prison. But what happened inside her mind during all those years? Did she ever feel guilt? Did she ever look at a 14-year-old girl and think, this is wrong? We may never know. Maxwell has shown little remorse in her public statements. At her sentencing, she maintained her innocence, claiming she was a victim of Epstein's manipulation, that she had been used and discarded like everyone else. Her lawyers argued that she was as much a victim as the young women she helped recruit. Perhaps she was. Perhaps she was both predator and prey, both abuser and abused. The human mind is capable of holding such contradictions. People can be victims in one context and perpetrators in another. They can be traumatized and traumatizing, exploited and exploiting. The accomplice's trap doesn't excuse participation, but it does explain how someone can become trapped in a web of their own making. One victim wrote to an FBI detective in 2023, apologizing for not testifying earlier. I was afraid and didn't want my name more associated with them than it was, and I'd spent a long time trying to distance myself from it all. But then she asked something remarkable. I'm wondering if you know of a way I could ever talk to Ghislaine in prison. I have questions and words, and while I don't assume there be closure, I'm hoping it might do something in my heart at least. That's the human mind trying to make sense of the senseless. Still seeking connection, still hoping for understanding, still believing that maybe, just maybe, facing the person who helped destroy your life might bring some kind of peace. Even after everything, she still wants to understand. She still hopes that confronting her abuser might do something in my heart. This is what makes these cases so heartbreaking and so complex. The victims aren't seeking revenge. They're seeking understanding. They're seeking acknowledgement. They're seeking some explanation that might help them make sense of why their lives were stolen. And the accomplices? They're left to live with what they've done, whether they acknowledge it or not. Maxwell will spend the rest of her life in prison, surrounded by the consequences of her choices. She may never admit what she did. She may never express genuine remorse. But she'll carry it anyway, in the silence of her cell, in the faces of the women who testified against her, in the knowledge that she could have chosen differently at so many points along the way. So what happens to the survivors? What happens when you've been manipulated by someone who viewed your humanity as a weakness to be exploited? What happens when the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones who handed you over? In 2020, a compensation fund was established for Epstein's victims. It has paid out $120 million to 150 survivors. But as one survivor wrote in her journal, financial restitution cannot undo the trauma. It's a horror story that I survived. I'm still so scared that Jeffrey is around every corner. Even now, even after he's gone. That's what they do to you. They live inside your head forever. A psychiatrist colleague of mine treats a patient who was one of Epstein's victims. He told me she has suffered for decades, but remains too terrified to speak out. Given how many end up dead. Not dead from violence, but dead from addiction, from suicide, from the slow erosion of hope that follows unhealed trauma. This is the long tail of psychological exploitation. The trauma doesn't end when the abuse stops. It doesn't end when the perpetrator dies. It echoes through every relationship, every moment of trust, every attempt at intimacy. The victim spends years, sometimes decades, rebuilding what was taken from them, and some never succeed. Research on survivors of sexual exploitation shows consistent patterns. Elevated rates of PTSD, depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. Difficulty forming trusting relationships. Hypervigilance, the constant scanning for threat that never really turns off. Dissociation, the mind's way of escaping when escape isn't possible. Shame that isn't theirs to carry, but that they carry anyway. Internalized from a world that too often blames victims. In only 14% of child sexual abuse cases are perpetrators convicted or plead guilty. For adult rape charges, it's just 1%. How can those rates help the psychological resolution of shame and suffering? How can a survivor heal when the system tells them, through its outcomes, that what happened to them doesn't really matter? One victim said, "The worst part is the silence. The world doesn't want to hear about it. They want the story to be over. They want to move on to the next headline, the next case, the next tragedy. But for us, it's never over. It's every day. It's every time someone touches us unexpectedly. It's every time we try to be intimate and feel that old fear rise up. It's every time we look at our own children and wonder if we're doing enough to protect them." The silence is its own kind of violence. It tells survivors that their suffering is inconvenient, that they should be over it by now, that they should stop talking about it. But trauma doesn't work that way. It doesn't follow a schedule. It doesn't care about what's convenient. Closure is a word we use often in true crime, but it's rarely accurate. For most survivors, there's no closure. There's no single moment when the pain ends and healing begins. There's only continuation, learning to live with what happened, learning to carry it without being destroyed by it, learning to build a life alongside the trauma rather than in its shadow. One victim wrote to an FBI detective in 2023, years after Epstein's death and Maxwell's conviction. She was apologizing for not testifying earlier. "I was afraid and didn't want my name more associated with them than it was, and I'd spent a long time trying to distance myself from it all." But then she asked something that stopped the detective cold. "I'm wondering if you know of a way I could ever talk to Ghislaine in prison. I have questions and words, and while I don't assume there'd be closure, I'm hoping it might do something in my heart at least." That quote captures something profound about the human need for understanding. Even after everything, the abuse, the decades of silence, the trial, the conviction, she still wants to understand. She still wants to know why. She still hopes that facing her abuser, asking her questions, speaking her truth directly, might do something in my heart. This is empathy, even in the aftermath of exploitation. The capacity to seek connection, to seek understanding, to hope for healing, even from the person who helped destroy your life. It's remarkable, it's heartbreaking, and it's deeply, profoundly human. Another survivor who testified at Maxwell's trial described the experience this way: "I don't know if I'll ever feel whole, but I feel less broken than I did. Speaking the truth, having it heard, having it believed, that matters. It doesn't fix everything, but it matters. It matters that someone finally listened. It matters that the record shows what happened. It matters that future generations will know the truth." Virginia Giuffre, one of the most prominent survivors, has spoken publicly about her journey. She was trafficked by Epstein and Maxwell as a teenager, forced to have sex with powerful men, including Prince Andrew. Years of therapy, Years of advocacy. Years of fighting for justice in systems that seemed designed to protect the powerful rather than the vulnerable. She has said that the fight itself became part of her healing, not because it erased what happened, but because it transformed her from victim to survivor, from passive to active, from silent to heard. She found purpose in protecting others. She found meaning in making sure that what happened to her wouldn't happen to the next girl. That's not closure. That's something else. That's transformation. That's taking the worst thing that ever happened to you and using it as fuel for something better. It doesn't undo the damage, but it creates something new in its place. Jeffrey Epstein will never face justice in a courtroom. His death in a Manhattan jail cell on August 10, 2019, was ruled a suicide, though conspiracy theories about his death continue to circulate and likely always will. The security footage that might have answered questions was unavailable. The guards who should have been checking on him were asleep. The questions that should have been answered never will be. For his victims, his death was a second trauma. They would never see him in court. They would never confront him. They would never hear him answer for what he'd done. They would never watch a jury pronounce him guilty. The man who had stolen so much from them had stolen even their day in court. One victim said after his death, "He robbed us again. He always had the last word." Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted. She is serving her sentence in federal prison. But for many survivors, her conviction, while meaningful, doesn't feel like full justice. She was an accomplice, not the architect. She was the bridge, not the destination. The architect escaped. The man who built the machine died before he had to face its consequences. So what is justice in a case like this? When the main perpetrator is dead, when the system failed for decades, when the powerful friends walk away unscathed, when the full truth may never be known, what does justice look like? Some survivors find justice in being heard, in testifying, in having their truth recorded in court documents that will exist forever, that researchers and historians will study for generations, that ensure the world will know what happened. Some find justice in the compensation fund, not as payment for their suffering, which is beyond any monetary value, but as acknowledgement that they were wronged, that the system recognizes what happened to them, that they are seen. Some find justice in advocacy, working to change laws, to protect future victims, to make sure this doesn't happen again. They channel their pain into purpose, their trauma into transformation. And some never find it at all. They carry what happened to them in silence, in shame, in solitude. The system failed them before, during, and after. And no verdict, no compensation, no acknowledgement can give back what was taken. Dr. Judith Herman, a psychiatrist who has studied trauma for decades, wrote in her landmark book, Trauma and Recovery, "Justice in the aftermath of atrocity requires more than punishment. It requires acknowledgement, reparation, and the restoration of civic trust." For Epstein's victims, that process is ongoing. It may never be complete, but the fact that they're speaking, that they're being heard, that the world is finally listening, that's a start. Understanding these psychological distinctions isn't just academic. It isn't just about satisfying curiosity or understanding historical cases. It has real-world implications that affect how we investigate crimes, how we sentence offenders, how we treat them, and, most importantly, how we prevent future victims. For law enforcement, understanding whether they're dealing with a psychopath or a sociopath changes everything about interrogation strategy. It changes how you approach a suspect, how you build rapport, how you elicit information. Psychopaths respond to logic and self-interest. They can be bargained with, manipulated, played. An investigator dealing with a psychopath might appeal to their ego, offer them a chance to show how smart they are, present confession as a logical choice that benefits them. The psychopath will calculate the costs and benefits and act accordingly. They're playing a game. And if you can make confession look like a winning move, they'll confess. Sociopaths need a different approach entirely. They're driven by emotion, not logic. They're reactive, volatile, easily triggered. An investigator dealing with a sociopath must acknowledge their emotional state, must avoid triggering their volatility, must work with their reactivity rather than against it. A confrontational approach will backfire. They'll shut down, lash out, or flee. A calm, validating approach might succeed. If you can make them feel understood, they may open up. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit trains agents in these distinctions. They know that reading a suspect wrong can mean losing a confession, or worse, triggering violence. They study these cases, these psychological profiles, because lives depend on getting it right. In the Epstein case, investigators had to understand not just Epstein himself, but the entire web of accomplices and enablers around him. They had to understand who could be flipped, who would cooperate, who would stonewall. They had to understand the psychology of people like Maxwell, people who were both perpetrators and victims, both abusers and abused. They had to navigate a landscape where nothing was simple and no one was exactly what they seemed. This is why psychological understanding matters in law enforcement. It's not about making excuses for criminals. It's about understanding how they operate so we can stop them. It's about understanding the people around them so we can dismantle the systems that protect them. It's about understanding victims so we can help them heal and encourage them to come forward. Every tool we have for fighting exploitation, every interrogation technique, every investigative strategy, every prevention program is built on psychological understanding. The better we understand how these dynamics work, the better we get at interrupting them. For the legal system, these distinctions affect sentencing, parole decisions, and treatment recommendations. They determine whether someone is released or kept in prison, whether they're offered treatment or written off as untreatable, whether they're seen as a candidate for rehabilitation or a permanent threat. A psychopath is unlikely to be rehabilitated. The research is clear on this. Traditional therapy doesn't work and can actually make them more dangerous by teaching them better manipulation skills. Parole boards considering a psychopath should know that the risk of reoffending is extremely high, that treatment programs are often a waste of resources, that the charming presentation they see in the hearing room is likely a performance. A sociopath might be rehabilitated with the right intervention. Trauma-informed therapy, long-term support, structured environments, building of emotional regulation skills. These can help some sociopaths develop the capacities they lack. Parole boards should evaluate sociopaths differently, looking for signs of genuine progress, capacity for connection, willingness to engage in treatment, evidence that they've done the hard work of understanding themselves. Understanding the difference could mean the difference between releasing someone who will kill again and successfully treating someone who won't. It could mean the difference between keeping someone locked up forever who might have been able to change and releasing someone who will go on to cause more harm. In the Epstein case, the legal system failed repeatedly. A 2007 non-prosecution agreement allowed Epstein to plead guilty to state charges, serve just 13 months in a county jail with work release, and register as a sex offender, while federal prosecutors looked the other way. That deal was negotiated by Alexander Acosta, who later became Trump's labor secretary and resigned amid criticism of his handling of the case. The legal system failed because it was dealing with someone who understood how to manipulate it. Epstein's Machiavellian intelligence allowed him to hire the best lawyers, to cultivate relationships with powerful people, to present himself as something other than what he was. The system wasn't designed to handle someone like him, someone with the resources to bend it to his will. This is why psychological understanding matters in the legal system. It helps us recognize when we're being manipulated. It helps us see through the performances that predators put on. It helps us make decisions based on reality rather than appearances. It also helps us treat victims appropriately, to understand why they might not report, why they might recant, why they might protect their abusers, why they might take years to come forward. When we understand trauma, we stop asking, why didn't she report immediately? And start asking, what can we do to make it safer for victims to come forward? The legal system is built on the assumption that people behave rationally. But trauma, Manipulation and psychological disorders don't follow rational rules. Understanding that is essential to justice. For mental health professionals, these distinctions guide treatment. You can't treat what you don't understand. You can't help someone heal if you don't know what's broken. A therapist using empathy-based techniques on a psychopath is wasting time and potentially making the problem worse. The psychopath doesn't need to learn to feel empathy. They need to learn behavioral rules, consequences, external controls. They need cognitive behavioral approaches that focus on behavior rather than emotion. They need structure, accountability, and clear consequences for actions. A therapist using rigid behavioral protocols on a sociopath is missing the point entirely. The sociopath's problem isn't lack of behavioral knowledge. It's emotional dysregulation rooted in trauma. They know right from wrong. They know the rules. What they can't do is manage the overwhelming emotions that flood them when they're triggered. Therapy for sociopaths should address the trauma, build emotional regulation skills, and develop healthy attachment. It should be patient, long-term, and trauma-informed. Different problems require different solutions. The DSM, Psychiatry's Diagnostic Manual, may not formally distinguish between psychopathy and sociopathy. It lumps them both under antisocial personality disorder. But effective treatment must distinguish. You can't use the same approach for someone who feels nothing and someone who feels too much. You can't use the same approach for someone born with hardware missing and someone whose hardware was damaged by trauma. For the victims of predators like Epstein, therapy requires something else entirely. Trauma-informed care, patience, understanding that trust may never come easily again, helping survivors rebuild what was taken from them, not by pretending the trauma didn't happen, but by integrating it into a life that continues forward. EMDR, cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, somatic experiencing. These are some of the evidence-based approaches that can help trauma survivors. But the most important factor is the therapeutic relationship itself. A survivor needs to feel safe, seen, and believed. They need to experience, in the therapy room, that not everyone will exploit them. That trust is possible. That connection doesn't always lead to harm. This takes time. It takes patience. It takes therapists who understand that healing isn't linear, that survivors will have good days and bad days, that progress sometimes looks like regression. One survivor described her therapy journey this way. For the first year, I just sat there. I couldn't talk. I couldn't even look at her. She just sat with me, week after week, never pushing, never judging, just being there. And eventually, I started to believe that maybe not everyone would hurt me. Maybe some people could be trusted. It took years to build that. And it started with someone who was willing to sit in silence with me. That's what trauma-informed care looks like. It's not quick. It's not easy, but it's essential. And for prevention, this understanding is perhaps most important of all. The ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences, conducted by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente in the 1990s, surveyed over 17,000 adults about their childhood experiences and current health. It identified 10 categories of adverse experiences: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, domestic violence, substance abuse in the household, mental illness in the household, parental separation or divorce, and incarceration of a household member. The findings were stark. Each additional ACE increases risk for violence, substance abuse, mental health problems, and antisocial outcomes. People with 4 or more ACEs are dramatically more likely to develop antisocial personality disorder than those with none. They're also more likely to have heart disease, cancer, diabetes. The trauma gets into the body. This isn't just correlation. Chronic childhood trauma physically alters brain development. Stress floods the developing brain with cortisol, which damages the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex while sensitizing the amygdala. Children who experience abuse don't just learn bad behavior. Their brains are literally reshaped for survival in a hostile world. If we want to reduce the number of sociopaths produced, we have to address childhood trauma Early intervention, family support, treating abuse as a public health crisis, home visiting programs for at-risk families, parenting classes, mental health services for children showing early behavioral problems, support for families in crisis. These are the real long-term solutions. They're expensive. They're difficult. They require political will and social commitment. But they work. Every dollar spent on early intervention saves multiple dollars in later costs. Prisons, hospitals, social services, lost productivity. More importantly, it saves human lives and human potential. The psychopath may be born, but the sociopath is made. And if we can understand the making, we might learn how to unmake the conditions that create them. As for predators like Epstein, the ones born with hardware missing, prevention looks different. It looks like better systems for identifying and stopping them before they can build their networks. It looks like taking accusations seriously, even when they involve powerful people. It looks like believing victims, even when it's inconvenient. It looks like not cutting deals that let predators walk free. It looks like a society that values the safety of children more than the comfort of the powerful. That's not easy. That requires courage, integrity, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. But it's the only way to prevent the next Epstein from building the next machine. We began this journey asking what makes the gap between empathy and evil. We've examined Epstein's psychology. We've listened to his victims. We've dissected the accomplice's trap. We've looked at the systems that failed and the survivors who continue to fight. Now, at the end, we have our answer. Jeffrey Epstein operated because he was born with hardware missing. His emotional system was fundamentally different from birth. He didn't choose to be cold. He was literally incapable of feeling warmth. His victims weren't people to him. They were objects, tools, means to an end. The Dark Triad wasn't something he developed. It was who he was from the beginning. Ghislaine Maxwell became trapped in a web of her own making. Trauma bonded to a predator, normalized to exploitation, compartmentalized beyond recognition. She was both perpetrator and victim, both abuser and abused. Her story is a warning about what happens when we lose ourselves in someone else's darkness. Their victims were 14-year-old girls on park benches. They were young people looking for connection, for opportunity, for someone to believe in them. They were dreamers who trusted, who hoped, who believed that the adults in their lives had their best interests at heart. They were human beings with the same needs, the same vulnerabilities, the same capacity for trust that we all have. Their empathy wasn't a weakness. It was a target. Their trust wasn't naivety. It was humanity. And the predators who exploited them weren't monsters from another dimension. They were humans who had lost, or never developed, the capacity to see other humans as anything more than tools. Understanding these distinctions doesn't excuse their crimes. Nothing could. The harm they caused is real, lasting, and unforgivable. But it does something perhaps more important. It forces us to see them as human beings, not monsters. And in that humanity lies the only real hope we have of preventing the next Epstein from forming in the first place. Because evil isn't one thing. It's many things. It's a spectrum, a constellation, 1,000 different pathways to the same destination. The psychopath may be born with hardware missing. The sociopath may be made by trauma and neglect. The accomplice may be trapped by dependency and fear. The enabler may be blinded by privilege and denial. But all of them are human. All of them are products of biology and environment interacting in complex ways. And understanding the full spectrum of human darkness is the only way we can hope to bring light to it. That doesn't mean forgiving the unforgivable. It means understanding it so deeply that we can recognize it, interrupt it, and prevent it. It means seeing clearly so we can act wisely. It means facing the darkest parts of human nature with open eyes, because only then can we protect the light. There's a tendency, when we learn about these cases, to distance ourselves, to say, I could never do that, to believe that these people are fundamentally different from us, that they belong to a separate category of being, that the line between good and evil runs clearly between us and them. But the science suggests otherwise. The capacity for violence exists in all of us. The capacity for self-deception, for rationalization, for looking away when we should act. These are not rare pathologies. They're human tendencies that exist on a spectrum. The difference between us and them isn't always a difference in kind. Sometimes it's a difference in degree, in circumstance, in biology, in luck. Sometimes it's a difference in the conditions that shaped them, the resources available to them, the interventions that might have helped them. You or I, with Epstein's brain, might have become Epstein. You or I, with Gacy's childhood, might have become Gacy. You or I, with Dahmer's isolation, might have become Dahmer. You or I, with Maxwell's losses and dependency, might have become Maxwell. That's not an excuse. It's not a justification. It's a warning. It's a call to humility. And it's a reminder that the line between good and evil doesn't run between us and them. It runs through every human heart. We all have the capacity for cruelty and kindness, for selfishness and sacrifice, for looking away and stepping forward. What makes the difference is the combination of biology, environment, choice, and chance that shapes each life. The victims in these cases weren't different from us either. They were ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. They were you and me if we had been born in different bodies, raised in different homes, approached on different park benches. Their vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was humanity. Their trust wasn't foolishness. It was the foundation of human connection. The only difference between them and us is that they encountered someone who weaponized those qualities against them. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of these cases. The same qualities that make life worth living: trust, hope, love, ambition, the desire to belong, are the qualities that predators exploit. They use our best against us. They turn our light into their weapon. Understanding that doesn't make us safer, but might make us wiser. It might make us more careful about who we trust. It might make us more protective of the vulnerable. It might make us more willing to believe victims when they come forward. And it might make us more humble about our own invulnerability. On August 10th, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein died in a Manhattan jail cell. He took with him the full truth of his crimes. How many victims, how many enablers, how many secrets. The security footage was unavailable. The guards were asleep. The questions will never be answered. But his victims live on. They carry what happened to them every day. They've spent years, decades, rebuilding lives that were shattered before they truly began. Some have found purpose in advocacy. Some have found healing in therapy. Some have found peace in private lives far from the spotlight. And some are still struggling, still fighting, still hoping that someday the weight will lift. Ghislaine Maxwell sits in a federal prison, serving 20 years. She will likely spend the rest of her life there, surrounded by the consequences of her choices. The powerful men whose names appear in flight logs and phone records, most of them have faced no consequences. They've issued statements, hired PR firms, and moved on with their lives. Their reputations may have suffered temporarily, but their freedom, their wealth, their positions remain intact. And somewhere, right now, another predator is learning. Another vulnerable person is being targeted. Another accomplice is being drawn into the web. Another victim is about to have their life stolen. The gap between empathy and evil isn't going away. It's part of the human condition, as old as humanity itself. As long as there are people with missing hardware and people with shattered software, as long as there are vulnerable people seeking connection and predators seeking victims, this dynamic will continue. But understanding it, really understanding it in all its complexity, is the only weapon we have. Understanding helps us see the signs. Understanding helps us believe victims. Understanding helps us build systems that protect the vulnerable and stop the predators. Understanding helps us heal. Understanding won't bring back what was stolen. It won't undo the damage. It won't give survivors the closure they deserve. but it might help ensure that the next 14-year-old on a park bench doesn't become the next name in a court document. If you or someone you know has experienced sexual abuse, help is available. RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, operates a 24/7 hotline at 800-656-HOPE. You can also visit their website at online.rain.org. The National Sexual Assault Hotline is confidential, free, and available whenever you need it. You're not alone, you're not to blame, and you deserve to be heard. I'm Dark Truths, True Crime Stories. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being willing to face these difficult truths. The only way through the darkness is together, with our eyes open and our hearts committed to something better. This has been a deep dive psychology presentation.